Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for inviting me to speak a second time. I'm going to talk about some of the specific rehabilitation implications linked to rugby. Claire has very clearly set out the parameters for the guidelines for ACL rehabilitation in a general sense across sports. I'm not going to go through that and repeat it, but I want to pull out a few things that I think might be of note that are specific for the sport of rugby. I alluded to this yesterday about the incidence of injuries, and I think this is fundamental to what we might need to do to modify our rehabilitation in this particular sport. So if you look at the general consensus for incidence of ACL injury, it's 50 to 80% will be non-contact reasons. And that's across a variety of sports, from basketball to netball to football or soccer, and Australian rules. But if you look at rugby, and that would be rugby union or rugby league, 56 to 86% of the injuries would be contact. That doesn't mean to say that there are no non-contact injuries. Almost half are non-contact injuries. But the authors would suggest that these extra contact injuries come from the sheer amount of collision that happens in that sport, and collision of people, quite often very big people, running at very high speeds. And so that probably skews the data a little, but it should make us think about how we rehabilitate them.
Now's my time to shine.
Oh, this was not meant to have sound, but we all
Looks,
thank you.
oh, it's Quaid that's gone down. Oh, he's just snapped a hamstring or something.
Don't know what that is.
It's just
This is Quaid Cooper,
Jesus.
an Australian, very well
Not
known
even
Australian
tackled.
rugby
Just
player who
hit by
had
the
an ACL
sniper, as
injury.
they say.
73% of those non-contact injuries in rugby happen in this way, which is an offensive run-in move, carrying the ball, which I'm going to move on to stop the noise,
Not even tackled, just
which would suggest that the ball carriers might be at risk. This is a really nice paper to have a look at that summarises it. They looked at about 36 incidences of ACL injury in the English Premier League rugby. Some of the findings are very similar to other sports, so 80% of those injuries happened in the second half, 50% of them happened in the last quarter. So that links very nicely to what we know is that there is a fatigue element that also puts these people at risk. So something that we have to put in our rehab program needs to link to that strength endurance to protect them for that. Of the non-contact mechanisms, they were tended to be in those sidestepping, cutting movements that you saw in the previous video with the offensive ball carrier. What they found, and those two nice pictures at the bottom were taken directly from that paper with those authors, was that the people who injured their ACL tended to land heel first with a straighter knee, which tended to put their knee into valgus as they cut. Those that they compared another 36 similar incidences with people who didn't get hurt, and those players landed either on the forefoot or a flat foot as they cut. So that starts to think about what we need to do in terms of movement re-education that we might need to put back into the rehabilitation program. If we think of the contact mechanisms, and so this is more specific to the sport again, there were two main sources of these injuries. One was being tackled, so again to note that somebody in an offensive move carrying the ball. It would seem that those people are more at risk than a defensive player. That would be at high or at low speeds, but with very large people landing on top of you when they pull you to the floor. The other side was rucking, and as I said yesterday, that is unique to that sport. 25% of the contact injuries happened in a ruck situation. And again, when you think of the number of people that might land on top of you in awkward positions, you can maybe see why that might happen. So I would direct you to that paper to have a look at a very nice summary of that. Talking about these big people crashing into each other and landing on top of each other, that person that looks a bit little there is Lee Halfpenny. He plays full-back for Wales and the British Lions. He's not that little, it's just that Alan Wynne-Jones, his playing teammate, is very big, as was the trophy, very big. This is what he looks like next to ordinary-sized people. And this is what he looks like playing. So if you can imagine those people crashing into each other at high speeds, something is going to happen. And so that maybe is what changes and skews the data in this particular sport. It does mean that we need to put something into the rehabilitation program that protects them against that. So let's have a look at some of the things I think might relate to what we've just talked about with the incidents. Quads and hamstring strength. Claire has talked about that. We know that that is important, but we need to look at this maximum strength for the ability to hold your position safely in a ruck position, the power and the explosive strength with a high rate of force development for the tackle type situations, and the strength endurance to deal with that fatigue related injury risk. We also need to look at relearning specific movement patterns for that sport. So it's about that forefoot to flat foot ground contact in a cutting manoeuvre. It's about maintaining a good ruck position. That might not be us that teaches that, but we need to understand what the coach requires when they go back. We need to look at this reactive agility that we've just heard mentioned as well. You know, do they make decisions under short time constraints? And doing things like drills, carrying a ball, so that they're already preparing themselves for that sport. So let's have a look at some of the strength options. We all think hamstrings when we think of ACL rehabilitation. Yes, of course, you have to have hamstring strength. There's lots of papers there that talk about ACL injury prevention programs that include hamstrings, and Nordic curls comes into that. But there's a whole load of other hamstring exercises you can do. So Romanian deadlifts, good mornings, hamstring curls. You can take your pick from those. We know that hamstring strength is protective for the ACL. Actually, there's no real link to performance related to hamstring strength. Doesn't mean to say we don't do it, but it's just, again, understanding where the importance lies. If we look at quad strength, yes, we know that's protective for ACL as well, mainly because it improves the mechanics of the movement as you go into those risk situations. But it is also predictive of performance, as Claire has already alluded to. I've put a whole range of quads exercises you can do for that. One of those is the split squat, and whether that's a split squat or a Bulgarian split squat, they are really useful as a rehabilitation device. Things like a triple extension movement, which I'll show you a video of later, is really important for that drive position in rugby. And obviously things like the leg press can be protective if they're not quite at the stage where they can go into those full range squats. So that's all well and good, but then you have to think of, okay, which of those exercises do I pick? What sorts of sets and reps do I get for maximum strength, strength endurance, power? There's all sorts of different literature there that can be quite confusing, not just about your choice of exercise, but how many do you give? How much weight do you give? How much rest do you give in between those things? And it's just about trying to work out what you need to do for that particular type of training, not just about the injury, and I think that's where that becomes quite important. So this is one example. I did put all these on silent, I promise. We're going to have a lot of this heavy music because he liked training to this music. This is what I've called protected maximum strength. So he's working to 85% of his 1 rep max. So it's got a high effort. And he's doing 5 sets of 5 reps, and he's taking 4 minutes rest between, so that he's fully recovered between each set, because we are really pushing to that maximum. He's doing a relatively slow rate of force development because we know that that gives him time to recruit as many motor units as they can to get that real maximum effort effect. Another way of doing that would be something that is a bit more functional. So a step-up movement would be an example, a split squat would be an example of those sorts of things. So what we know that this maximum strength efforts, they improve work economy, they improve rate of force development when you eventually start including that with things like box jumps. And they obviously include those maximal effort strength episodes, which they need for those positions where they're going to be vulnerable when they go back into these contact situations. Then we need to think about converting this to this power, to this fast rate of force development. So instead now of doing a basic squat or a leg press, he's changed that to what we would call clean pulls. So the drive is a much faster rate of force development, and because of that we've dropped the percentage of the 1 rep max. But he's still doing 5 sets of 5, so it's a relatively small number because he's still doing a high effort, but he's only got about 2 minutes rest. So we're looking again at being able to turn this over a little bit more, that has a little bit of an endurance effect to it. And we've got our box jumps. He's quite good at box jumps. There is also some evidence there to suggest that if you do this type of rate of force development exercise alongside maximum strength, once you've established some maximum strength baseline, you can actually enhance that whole thing faster. So you don't have to finish a maximum strength phase and then move on to this explosive movement. You can start to switch it into your program alongside some of these other efforts. So it's worth thinking about some of those things. Some other options that you have is to then start looking at this endurance effort at a maximum effort of movement. So some of these are what we would call high intensity circuits. So you can see we've got him doing a mix of explosive type movements, about sustained muscle action movements, and the video hasn't stalled there. It's his rest was in that semi-squat position, so that he has to hold a position that's really hard to burn his quads, and then he has to move from that and do something explosive in between again. And he would do that flat out, and you can see as he gets to the end of it, he's really struggling not to put his hands on his legs to hold him in that one position. Those are fairly short circuit efforts. We might go for a 3 or 4 minute circuit like that, and then give a relative rest. And then maybe it might be a hard, short and sharp training session of about half an hour, and you can see he's really struggling in that position right at the end. Holding his hands on his head, poor thing. Let's move on. Again, I can't emphasize this part enough. It's about the difference between agility and reactive agility. Just because somebody can do a T drill or a yo-yo drill or a figure of 8 drill or hops, when they can plan what they're going to do, it doesn't mean to say that they can actually then transfer that into the field of play. And in fact, there's evidence to show that it doesn't transfer. So what you can see on the left is a basic T drill. It's a good agility exercise. I use that because it makes them push into either direction. But I would introduce that first and then start adding in these extra challenges. So the video on the right is where we were doing some work with GlaxoSmithKline with some equipment that we're developing. And you can see that the guy is running over a series of mats. As he steps onto the second mat, a picture comes up on the TV screen of a player running towards him. And depending on whether we're doing offensive or defensive drills, he's going to run into a different direction. And the other mat that he then runs over records how fast he makes his decision, how fast he completes the task, and whether he's actually run in the right direction or not, or whether he's just guessed. So that's where we can start to increase the challenge and where we can make it very specific for the sport that they're doing just by putting something up on a screen in that way. So that's some of the work that we're starting to look at, and I've just had a PhD student that's finished looking at it with ankle stability, which is why I haven't included his work in this, but that's starting to look very promising. There is some work out there already on it, and this is a European paper. It's not sport specific, but it is again showing the difference between progressing from planned agility to this context specific reactive agility, which is really, really important. I've got a couple of examples of players just to show you about this return to play time. So this is Lee Halfpenny again. He had his injury playing Italy in September 2015 in a warm-up before the World Cup. for those of you that don't follow rugby, he was meant to be one of our secret weapons in the team. It was pretty devastating in our country when he got injured. I didn't treat this guy, by the way. All this has come from public domain, social media. He blogged about his recovery and he posted on Instagram and Twitter, so it's quite an interesting story to follow, actually. So he had his ACL reconstruction and he also had a meniscal repair. He went back to some non-contact protected training in March 2016. So we're talking about 6-7 months post-injury. Didn't really play for most of the rest of that season. Eventually went back to international rugby in November 2016 in the autumn, following autumn internationals. Knowing that he's meant to be a really accurate kicker, very solid player, one of the key people in the team, he kicked one and missed two. Very unusual for him, and there was comments about him not being quite the player that he was. That's a year out, over a year out. He then played in the Six Nations the following spring, so we're now up to about 18 months post-injury, and he got man of the match in Italy, playing Italy in Rome. So that's where I would say he was probably back to his performance, pre-injury performance level, because he was playing in there in the way that he did. To get to that stage, because he didn't play very well in the autumn, he only got back into the side because the person who had taken his place got injured. And again, that's talking about that length of your career afterwards. If you're out for that length of time, it isn't just about the player's recovery and their ability, it's who else has come up in competition to them that might now be better than them. And that's something that's a real concern for the players. The good news is that he then got picked for the British and Irish Lions for the tour now out to New Zealand in June. And to bring it right up to date, I pulled this off Twitter yesterday morning as I was following the scores, and he again kicked 20 points from the Lions defeating the Maori All Blacks 32-10. He kicked 6 penalties and a conversion, so that was 7 kicks out of 7, so his accuracy had returned at that point. Just one more thing to talk about that is when they looked at his reconstruction, they had to look at the balance between, do they use a hamstring to avoid some of the anterior knee pain, but he is that kicker and that accuracy.